time to fire the employee, and you want to make sure that you have all that documented, right? It's one of the major things that a judge is going to be looking for, in a wrongful termination type of lawsuit. Is, did you follow good, reasonable human resource practices? Did you follow them consistently? Were they well accepted practices? And did you have stuff documented? Did you document these, alleged instances of, inappropriate behavior, bad performance, whatever it is? So, yeah, you want to make sure that you've got your facts and specifics documented. It may well come in handy later if it turns into a lawsuit. Yeah.
Do you recommend, I've been to some companies where this is policy, somewhere it's suggested, and somewhere it's not, to have another person, another manager present when you're giving someone a coaching conversation or a review.
Right.
Because either, like I've had situations where I've written people up before and they're like, well, I'm not signing that.
Yeah.
And so then you have the other manager go, it was delivered, they were told, the person refused to sign.
Right.
Or, the fact that you're kind of covering yourself from any sort of discrimination or...
Yeah, no, I would say kind of a good rule of thumb, the answer is no. You don't need to have anybody else present unless, right, there's some kind of compelling reason, whether it's, you're giving someone significantly negative feedback, there's something about the employee that suggests that this might not go well, maybe they're sort of a belligerent employee or something like that. So in those cases, yeah, if there's any question about it, why not bring someone else in? So if there's any reason to think that you might need another person, great. But otherwise, probably not necessary. So, yeah, very good. Okay, on the positive side, Jennifer?
I was saying, I've had managers, when you sit down and you have like one-on-one interviews, or not necessarily interviews, meetings or whatnot, and they can specifically say like things that I've done right.
Yeah.
That's just reinforcing the behavior of wanting to be motivated, wanting to do things good. So I think coming, not just saying, hey, you're doing a great job, but you can like provide specific examples and then provide continuous feedback on that. Definitely reinforcing what they do.
Yeah, very good. I couldn't say it better myself, right? It's not just the negative side. People, when they get positive information, they typically want to know, well, what did I do right? Sort of a generic, broad, overly broad, hey, way to go, good job, isn't terribly helpful. It's like, okay, can you tell me specifically, what did I do that was so good? Because I want to make sure that I'm continuing to do those right kinds of behaviors. So yeah, you want to give specifics, whether you're delivering negative information or positive information.
Especially if you're doing both. If you have to deliver some negative, it's always good to have those specifics of positive. So like, although you're not doing X right, you are doing A, B, C, and D all right. So.
Yeah, good, right, yeah. Which we'll kind of talk about in a moment. It's kind of like a sandwich technique kind of issue. But yeah, I think in general, good idea. Yeah, good. Okay, so a couple of good tips. Roy, hopefully what I'm beginning to suggest that there are some important things you can do if you are that manager, like so many of us who is, who struggles with giving negative feedback. There are a few things you can do to really help yourself deliver that negative information, and it has to do with preparation. So giving frequent feedback before the meeting, gathering specific facts and examples are important things to do to help you deliver the negative feedback effectively and to prepare yourself for its consequences potentially. Know what you want to achieve is another preparation issue. Again, sometimes managers will just kind of sit down and wing it. I would encourage you guys, of course, to not do that, to make an outline of the points you want to cover so that you've got an agenda to follow, to keep yourself on track, on time, and such things. And I'd encourage you to consider giving the employee that outline in advance, or some kind of advance notice of what's going to be covered. Now, like so many things we talk about here, this is not an absolute. This is kind of a rule of thumb. That in general, it's a good idea to give people an advance warning about what's going to be talked about. There are definitely times you don't want to do that. And a good example is that employee, who's maybe, right on the edge of being fired. Maybe going to be talking about lots of negative information. In that case, probably not going to be very helpful to give the outline in advance. But assuming that it's just generally a pretty good, at least a pretty good employee, someone who appears to care. As an employee, they want to keep their job, they want to be there. For the most part, it's a good idea to give the outline in advance. And let me sort of turn that to you guys and say, would you want to have the outline in advance? I'm guessing for most of you, the answer is yeah. I would like to know in advance what we're going to be talking about. So, you can spin the table around and see why it's such a good idea, I think. And we're not talking about like a week in advance, especially if you're going to be delivering some negative information to the employee. they can just lose a lot of sleep that week, stewing over what, these negative things are going to be said. So I wouldn't give it too far in advance. Again, a decent rule of thumb, I think, is about a day. Or if you're giving a late afternoon appraisal, maybe give it in the morning. The person doesn't lose any sleep that night. But about a day is probably, a reasonable compromise. Not too short before the meeting, but not too long.
What do you say in regards to giving out a rubric of, what you're essentially graded on, reviewed on, in advance? Because that way they can kind of figure out, well, I don't do that, so I'm not quite an excellent, I'm a more above average.
Yeah.
So they can kind of figure out what they think they're going to be.
Sure. I mean, ideally, you've done that a long time ago.
Yeah.
Right? But if nothing else, sure, maybe a sort of a reminder of your things that we talked about as you came on board.
Yeah, do it when you're hired, but then, like a week before, go ahead, just let you know we have the review coming up in a week. This is the rubric you got when you were hired.
Yeah.
We'll be talking about it specifically.
So in addition to the outline, here's just a reminder of the rubric that the work that we use to evaluate performance. Yeah.
So it's cool, this one job I actually had, they didn't, give you a number, like 4 through, they did it on a continuum, and they did it on a, evolving, getting there, had, excelled at this, and then you have like different layers based off of that, and so then beforehand, I went through it, and I would mark down, I think I'm here, and give a comment why, and I think I'm here, and then my supervisor did the same, and then we got together and kind of went over, and if there was any really big differences, then we would discuss that. So I thought the continuum was like so much better than saying, you're just not that good at this, or you're just good at that, just because then it can show you to evolve throughout the process.
Yeah, one of the topics that was not bitten off for a workshop later on, which is a little bit unfortunate, but I wasn't going to press you guys to take it, is performance appraisal. And there's a lot to be said about good performance appraisal. It kind of goes beyond the scope of this class, but you're bringing up a couple of issues, right? In a class like that, you would talk about things like, do you want to do just supervisor evaluations in your company, or do you want to do something more like a 360 evaluation, where like everyone around you is evaluating you? Your subordinates evaluate you, your peers evaluate you, your manager evaluates you, maybe other managers evaluate you. And you also brought out the self-evaluation, right? Which is an interesting addition. A lot of times people are even more critical of themselves than anybody else would be. Of course, you can also do something in between, right? As you bring out, you can have maybe just not a full 360 because it's expensive and time consuming, but maybe you pick a couple of sources, right? Rather than just have the supervisor's evaluation, maybe you have a supervisor and a self or something like that. Yeah.
Actually had a manager, they went to this conference one time, and you register beforehand, and so the people who were conducting the conference actually went out and seeked out your ultimate superior, a couple of your employees, people that you interact with. It's completely anonymous, but they gave actual, very honest feedback. And so then when they went to this conference, they completely broke them down hardcore as far as this is what you're doing wrong, and they kind of built them up back. But I thought that was kind of a unique way to do it. I don't know if I'd make it through it.
It is a powerful tool, and not all that you need. A lot of major companies if they don't do a full 360, full 360 degrees, meaning all the way around you, but they come close to it. Yeah, it can be. If nothing else, it's a much more objective, right? It takes away a lot of the politics and things that can get in the way of one person evaluating. You could have an agenda or, some reason why they're going to blow you up or tear you down or something like that. But yeah, right, a very powerful method of performance appraisal. We also bring up different ways of appraising. You can have sort of refer to continua, or there's something called a behaviorally anchored rating scale, which is a pretty useful and commonly used technique, where you basically take the person's job description and you break it down into all the behaviors, or as many as you can, to the most relevant behaviors that constitute the person's job, and then you develop for each one of those behaviors, you sort of get a a list of about maybe like a 10-point scale would be kind of the most common from 1 to 10, and like a 1 would be sort of the worst behavior you could do in that position. You sort of talk to people, other people who do their job, and others who have held a job in the past, and your own knowledge, and you kind of get the worst behavior, and you kind of get the best behavior. What's a 10? for that behavior. And then you come up with behaviors for, 2 through 9 in between. And you use those as a way to try to, to get the kind of specific information that you're referring to, rather than sort of a vague way to go in this dimension, or, not so good in this dimension as you were describing, but kind of specific. Here's what your behavior looks like, along this dimension, and here across your entire job. A lot of managers find that to be extremely effective techniques. We can give a lot of good information, and it takes a lot of time to put those skills together. But once you got them together, then it's just a pretty quick run through to pick the right behaviors, and can be a great tool. Yeah, very good. Again, kind of beyond the scope of this course, but all useful things for us to at least mention. Okay, let me just throw the question out to you that I was about to ask, and that is just to make sure that we're clear on this. Why is it such a good idea to give the outline in advance? Why would an employee want the outline in advance? Yeah.
Well, I hope it's fine. The employee can look at it and decide for a lot rather than he gives the guy 10 days to think and he's expected to know exactly how to interview.
Yeah.
But I'd have to think too is, in order to make your interview as efficient on time as possible, I mean, if Aaron kind of go through it and skips in there, he has to make the process with the
Yeah. Right. And I think one of the reasons why that's so true is gets back to the concept of attributions that we talked about last class. Especially if you're giving that negative information, chances are pretty good that when the employee sees, the negative goals and the areas of improvement or whatever, if you give that information to them live during the meeting, you may get, 15 different reasons, typically external attributions to why those negative things happen. Here's a reason, here's a reason. But if you give it to them in advance, they can kind of do some self-vetting, of their excuses, if you will, external attributions, whatever they're going to say. And they often, I think, at least in my experience, they'll come armed with like many fewer of them. They kind of boil it down and say, okay, yeah, I thought about this, and I got to say that you're right, Mr. or Ms. Manager, but if I can just explain, a couple of things as to why that happened, and it makes a much more efficient conversation. You can deal with those issues more efficiently than hearing the long laundry list of external attributions. So, yes, very good.
I was kind of thinking of the same way Brandon was. I was also going to add, then also if you gave him the information in advance, at the end you could, if they wanted to backtrack on it or say what they what they were going to say or what they meant, you could say well, you had the information in advance, So they couldn't. It's like a debate. They give you all the questions in a debate in advance, so that no one can say well, I really meant, or I really was gonna say, but I forgot to say. So you can always have those solid things.
Yeah, very good. Exactly. Very good. Okay, so again, you guys probably can think of other reasons, but a good idea in general. There are always exceptions, but in general, a good idea to give people to outline in advance. So that's all on the preparation side, right? So hopefully you've prepared well. Now it's time to open the interview. It's time to conduct the interview. The best tip that I can give you from my own experience and the literature in this area is something that's a little bit non-intuitive, I think, for many of us. Because if you think about how most people open the interview, does it involve listening? Or when the average manager conducts a performance appraisal, does the manager do a lot more talking than listening, right? I mean, if you think about appraisals you've had, I bet for the most part the manager kind of sits you down, and then just starts talking, right? And it might be 5 minutes, it might be 10 minutes, it might be a half an hour before you're given an opportunity to say anything, right? So again, some managers do a good job of this, but I think many managers don't. They do way too much talking at the beginning of an interview. A job like a performance appraisal interview. The advice I want to give is to, you got to say something, right? Hi, welcome, thanks for coming. You don't have to say nothing. But in sort of relative proportion to what the average manager does, put in more listening, relative to talking than the average manager. All kinds of reasons why doing a lot of listening at the beginning of the interview tends to help. One of which is on the slide here. It gets back to that concept of participation. Remember, we've covered this a couple different times, a couple different ways in this class. We mentioned it in motivation, we mentioned it in group dynamics. One of the great principles of management, at least in most cultures, not necessarily in every culture, but certainly here in the U.S. and many cultures, in general, you'll find that the more you allow people to participate in almost anything, all kinds of good things tend to happen. People tend to understand what's going on during the conversation. They tend to be more satisfied with it. They tend to be more committed to whatever is discussed. And of course, those are three critically important things to have happen during a feedback giving session, right? I mean, if you want your employees to understand, accept, and be committed to whatever you talk about, of course you do, right? And one of the best ways to make that happen is to allow for some participation, right? To allow your employees to speak, to get their thoughts on the table. So that's one reason, is the power of participation. The other reason, once again, gets back to those attributions that we've been talking about. You know, again, even if you gave your outline in advance to your employee, chances are they're going to have some thoughts on their mind, right? They've seen the outline, they've seen that there are 10 points you're going to cover, and 3 of them are on the negative side. Yeah, they're going to come in probably with some thoughts about that, and often some external attributions, right? Some reasons as to why, you know, that was out of their control, something that wasn't their fault, whatever. And, you know, you can imagine, you know, 2 interviews, right? 2 otherwise identical interviews. One is where you do all the talking as a manager, you don't listen, and the employee is sitting there stewing. You know, just sitting there thinking, man, if I could just get a word in here, if my manager would just shut up for a second, I could explain why this is unfair, why this is not accurate, right? Instead, I just gotta sit here and take it because I'm gonna be polite while my manager is talking to me, talking at me, right? But in scenario 2, you know, same interview, you do a lot of listening at the beginning. You give the employee the opportunity to sort of air their closet, you know, to get those external attributions out there, so they're not sitting there stewing about them throughout the conversation. And again, at least in my experience, you're going to find that the overall conversation is going to go better, be much more effective if you let the person, you know, get those thoughts out on the table at the beginning instead of sitting on them throughout the conversation. If nothing else, I think you'll find much better listening to go on throughout the interview if the person is allowed a chance to express themselves at the beginning. So those and other reasons I'm sure you can think of suggest why it's important to do maybe more listening than you might have otherwise thought about at the beginning of a feedback. So once you've hopefully, you know, opened the interview adequately, done some listening, now it's time to conduct the interview and get the information out there. A few thoughts for you. One is called the sandwich technique. I mentioned this a moment ago, and I bet many of you are familiar at some level with the sandwich technique. What is it?
Good, bad, good.
Yeah, right? It's the sandwich metaphor, right? You give good information at the beginning of the meeting. You get the negative information out in the middle. That's kind of the, you know, the meat or the, you know, cheese or whatever in the middle of the sandwich. And then the other slice of bread on the other side is more positive information, right? So good information, negative information, good information is the sandwich metaphor. All kinds of good psychology to support the sandwich technique as to why it helps often in a feedback interview. You know, if I give you guys a list of 100 things about yourself, and well, first of all, which ones are you most likely to remember out of that list of 100?
Primacy and recency.
Very good. Never told the psychologist here. Yeah, the psychologist will talk about the primacy effect and the recency effect. Basically, if you hear a list of things, the ones you're most likely to remember, all else being equal, would be the first things on the list and the last things on the list. And so applying that psychology to the interview, that suggests that the employee is more likely to walk away with a better memory of the first and last things that you talked about. And so why not have those first and last things be more on the positive side, to have the employee walk away hopefully with something of a good feeling about what went on during that conversation. Now, having said that, of course, you might be thinking, well, wait a second. You know, we don't want every feedback interview to be, you know, warm and fuzzy. You know, you might be delivering very serious negative information. You know, you don't necessarily want the person to walk away with it, you know, big happy feeling about the meeting, going up prepared, right? Psychology also tells us that if I give you a list of 100 things about yourself, and they're all positive, except for item number 49, you know, are you going to be able to remember number 49 after the meeting? Yeah, I mean, human beings have very old grudges. Yeah, well, hopefully not a grudge, but yeah, well, maybe, right? But the point being that human beings have a very strong capacity to be able to remember and process almost anything that's negative that's said about them, right? So it's not like the negative information is going to disappear. It's not going to get lost. You know, it's still going to be there, but it's going to be hopefully at least blunted a little bit, you know, by the effect of the sandwich technique. So some pretty good psychology suggesting why it's a pretty good way of delivering feedback to somebody. You know, begin someone with something positive, get to the negative information, you know, get it out there, and then finish with something relatively positive. Can be a pretty good way in general of conducting feedback. Now, there's some caveats here, you know, one of which is that, at least in my experience, the sandwich technique is much more effective with relatively inexperienced I'll say young, but of course young people can be very experienced, so maybe experienced is better. More mature employees, on the other hand, have seen it all, Someone who's been in the company, been in the workforce for, decades, they've seen every kind of feedback interview, they know what managers do. And so if we try to, overdo the sandwich technique with a more experienced employee, you shouldn't be surprised if you hear something like, hey, take off the cake load, just give it to me straight, don't do all the sandwiching with me or whatever. So again, I guess I would say that I think some sandwiching works well for anybody. I mean, why not at least begin the conversation with a friendly hello? That's something positive, Why not end the conversation with a friendly goodbye? As we'll talk about, a pledge, to help, to do what you can to support the person. That's still sandwiching, something positive at the beginning and something positive at the end. But if you're dealing with an experienced employee, I wouldn't overdo the sandwich technique, right? Having said that, again, some sandwiching I think works for pretty much anybody in any case. Focusing on problems and behaviors and not the person, a very important concept. I think many of us can relate to this where what we're talking about here basically is focusing the conversation on things that people can do something about. I actually sat in, I was a third party in a feedback interview at one point where the manager actually called the employee stupid.
Do they use that sandwich technique?
I don't recall, but probably not. I think it was a pretty negative session all the way through, among other things. The person was called stupid during the feedback interview. And, there are a lot of things you can say about why that's not a good idea, but one of them falls into this principle, right? The employee can't help stupid. I mean, who knows if the person was stupid or not, I have no idea. But, it's like, sorry, boss, I can't help stupid. How about you give me something that I can actually change, So as a manager, instead of calling somebody stupid, why not focus on problems and behaviors, things that they can actually do something about. So instead of saying, hey, you're dumb, you're stupid, why not say something like, look, in this particular date, this particular circumstance, here's what you did. And, maybe not the best choice. Here's maybe how you could have done it differently. That's basically the same thing, more or less. It's a stupid comment, but it's much more constructive, right? We can actually say, okay, all right, yeah, I guess I can see why that wasn't the best choice. Maybe I can do something better next time, right? So instead of focusing on traits, characteristics, don't criticize people for being introverts, for being type A or type B or, whatever. It's just not very constructive. People really can't do much to change their fundamental traits, characteristics, personality. But if you get down to behaviors and specific problems, that's where it can be much more constructive, and you can get the thing that people can actually do something about. Yeah.
I've always followed the philosophy of the what, why conversation, what you did, what you need to do, and why.
Good. Yeah, it's a similar kind of idea here, and much more useful, constructive things to focus on if you follow that kind of approach. That's a good thing. Offer specific examples. We've pretty much already covered that. Delaying and limiting criticism. We've covered that a few times in class. Again, the earlier in the conversation that you bang on somebody, that you criticize them, in general, the less good listening is going to occur after that in the conversation. So, always exceptions once again, but a pretty good general principle to walk in with is to kind of backload the criticism toward the back of the conversation, right? You can still do some sandwiching, you can still, use those kinds of principles, but to, in general, put the criticism, the negative stuff, toward the back of the feedback here. Pretty good idea in general. Last idea is to combine goal setting with performance appraisal. I'll put this in a little bit more bold print, only to signify that I think it's a very strong and good principle, but one that not that many managers do. That's why I'm bold, because I think it's just not that common. And so let me just even appeal to your guys' experience. How many of you guys have had, when you've had a feedback interview, did you simultaneously, like a same meeting, do goal setting? A few hands up, several people, that's good. I'm also betting, though, for the same people who raised your hand, I bet you've had other supervisors who didn't do that. But still, that's good. I'm encouraged to hear some of that going on. Let's talk about this. Why is it a good idea to do goal setting when you're giving feedback? I mean, it's time consuming, yeah, it makes a long meeting longer maybe, but let's maybe break it down this way. Sort of the positive, negative information angle. It really doesn't, sort of regardless of whether you're giving positive or negative information, it's a great time to do goal setting. What if you're getting a lot of positive information? Why is this a good time to do goal setting?
It can take you into a direction that you want to achieve.
Good, yeah, kind of talked about sort of path goal theory and those kinds of ideas, right? You know, why not leverage the good feelings that are coming out of this meeting and begin to talk about the future, talk about future goals, paths towards those goals in order to, right, keep the good times rolling, right? Good. Other thoughts?
Well, I mean, there's lots of things from good. You can, when you set goals, you can talk. I mean, the thing is action plans, how they're going to achieve it, and so you can find out how they did it, how they plan to do more, and so you can leverage that instead of just being like, well, you exceeded, you know, like you got the excellent on the continuum, you know, let's push you past that excellent, and so you can get more out of that individual, and on the bad, you want to have a goal setting, you know, in that action plan, how they're gonna make steps to fix the problem. So
yeah, since we're bringing it up, let's talk about that negative side. Let's say you're giving a lot of negative information to an employee. Why is it, again, a great time to do goal setting? You've gotten this started. Other thoughts about why that's a good time to do goal setting?
Put you back on track.
There you go. Okay, putting the person back on track. I hope we're talking about specifics, right? Again, kind of a path goal theory idea, not to just abandon your employee, but to say, let's talk specifically about how you can get back on track. Good. Other thoughts?
They can give you like some sort of, or give them an idea of the expectations you have as far as like fixing the problems.
Okay, good, yeah, so there's a renewed discussion about expectations, that can be an important part of it. Other reasons?
I think it gives them a sense of your support, that you're there, you're going to work with them, not just get them up on track, that you're working together.
Yeah, that's an important one that I wanted to get on the table. I mean, of course, Lindsay's comment and others are very good ones, but I think that's kind of a key one, right? Is to make sure that you are showing your employee you're not abandoning him or her, right? That you're going to be there for them, to give your support, and you know, well, you can only give so much support, you know, to an employee who's really struggling, but that can be an important signal to the employee that you're not abandoning or giving up on them. And so having a discussion about the future, right, is in and of itself a good signal that the person's not going to get fired tomorrow, right? You're saying, okay, let's talk about the future. You know, we're assuming that you employees never want to feel this way again, right? This is probably not a very happy conversation for you. You know, you probably want to redeem yourself. You know, you want to make things better in some sense. So let's talk about the future. And in so doing, you're giving the employee a signal that you're going to support that. That needs itself up. Very good. All right. So yeah, whether you're giving a lot of positive information, a lot of negative information, good time to do goal setting. All right. And then closing the interview. There's a few things that you can think about as you wind things up. One of which is to genuinely offer your assistance. Please don't do this unless you can be genuine about it. I mean, that goes without saying, but sometimes managers will say that without really meaning it. You know, if you can genuinely offer your assistance, your support, that's a good thing to leave the employee with. Again, if it's a great employee, maybe that's kind of implied, but a good thing to say anyway. If it's a struggling employee, it's very important. They're going to want to hear it. They're hoping to hear that you as a manager are going to assist and support. And then finally, don't forget about feedback giving from the standpoint of closing the loop, right? You want to make sure that you restate the agreed upon steps for improving performance. You know, you probably talked about a lot of things in this conversation, maybe including goals. And you can't assume that good listening has occurred, as we talked about. So a good time to, you know, there are different ways you can do it. Sometimes managers will ask their employee to repeat it back to them. Pretty risky and probably not the best approach, you know, because your employee is probably going through all kinds of emotions, you know, dealing with negative feedback. They may not have even been listening for the 10 minutes of the conversation, you know, human interaction just like that. So rather than, I think, put the burden on your employee to restate what was talked about during the meeting, I think it's time for you as a manager to do this one yourself and say, okay, I want to make sure that good listening has occurred. You know, let me just go through quickly, you know, the 5, 10, 15, whatever major things that we talked about during this meeting, and then follow it up with a memo, right? Get a document out there, you know, where you, again, provide them, sort of paper form, you know. Here's what we talked about, basically to set up that contract for next time, right? To make it clear that, you know, here's what we talked about, for better or for worse, and this is the first document I'm going to try out, you know, next time we talk, because it could be a good basis for discussion, especially if you can face it, right? So a good idea to get that documentation as a follow-up to restate the agreed upon steps for improving performance. Okay? So with that, hopefully useful for everybody. I know, you know, the first time I started doing some learning in the world of feedback giving, I was kind of dismayed at how little of this I was doing. You know, it's like, oh crap, you know, I don't do any of this stuff. I must not be very good at giving feedback. You know, if that's your experience, you know, please don't lose heart. We can all do a better job, myself included. Being better at giving feedback. And hopefully with this, we've got a lot of good takeaways, you know, things that we can be doing in preparation, conducting the interview, closing the interview, to try to all do a more effective job of giving feedback. All right. Questions or comments before we move on? All right, well, let me just go ahead then. Before we move on to our, we're kind of, you know, grinding the gears here and moving on as we all so often do in this class. That kind of closes our section on communication, although, you know, to some degree, lots of what we talk about here is communication at some level. We're kind of closing our formal section on communication, and we're going to move on to a new topic, which is conflict and conflict handling. Although lots of connection between the two, it's not like it's a totally different topic. An awful lot of good conflict handling skills are basically good communication skills, so clear connections there. But before we do, I want to sort of take a little bit of a time out in the class and talk about the Bob Moulton case. I kind of like the Bob Moulton case at this time of the course, mainly because I think it's a pretty good sort of review case. That you can think about the Bob Moulton case and use it to connect to almost every topic that we've talked about so far in the class. And if it's not, you know, fresh in your head, you might even take a look at your syllabus and see the topics that we've, you know, what road have we covered so far. We've talked about groups and group dynamics. Right? There are some problems, issues here in groups and group dynamics. We talked about leadership, right? Certainly some leadership problems in this case. We talked about individual differences, right? There are some interesting individual difference issues that go on in this case. We talked about motivation. I think there are motivation problems and things that can be said about this case. Power and politics. You know, there are some power and politics types of issues here. Communication, you know, issues galore in this case. All kinds of arguably poor communication going on in this case. So that's kind of what I want to do. You know, at this point in the class is just to take a few minutes and get some thoughts from you guys, you know, from sort of a, you know, again, a problem statement kind of perspective. I didn't ask you to prepare a problem statement, but I'm sure you can kind of do it. You know, what problems do you see in the Bob Moulton case? And if you can try to kind of connect them up to our course topic, so much the better. You know, can you give me a group dynamics problem that's going on? Can you give me a communication problem? Whatever. That's something someone ponder that for a moment and get us started. What problems do you see in the Bob Moulton case? Don't make me regret not having you come up with prepared problems. What are you seeing?
Bob was filtering his true feelings about Fester? Is that the guy?
Yeah, Fester, right? You picture him like this bald head, right? Like the Uncle Fester from the... Yeah, Fester. So yeah, some filtering. I made as an example maybe of bad communication. Yeah, remember our barriers to communication? There are any number of them that you might trot out for this case, but yeah, you do see some filtering going on. He's got, you know, a full message that maybe he wants to pass along to this individual, but passes along very little of it.
And to his manager as well.
And to his manager, good. Filtering going on in each direction. Very good. Okay. Great example. Thanks for getting us started. What other problems do you see in here that pertains to anything we talked about in this class? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, at least if you take Milton's word for it, right? You might debate that, right? But he at least feels like the leadership is being usurped, right? It's being just, he was just stolen from him, right, by Fester. So definitely at least gets at a leadership issue. Since we're kind of on leadership, why don't we go ahead and stay there for a moment? Can anybody, you know, expand on that? What do you think about that? Is Fester actually, you know, stealing leadership? What do you think?
Well, the boss doesn't delegate any responsibilities. He just lets Fester kind of join in, and he kind of just takes over essentially without giving any power to the leader.
Okay. Yeah, so looking at leadership here, you can kind of look at Knowlton and kind of carve him up in terms of some maybe poor leadership he's showing. But as you're suggesting, there are other leaders in this case, one of whom is Gerald, right? Knowlton's boss, who apparently is making some mistakes also, one of which you could argue is not doing a very good job of giving clear job descriptions, right? That you sort of throwing people into a group and sort of saying, hey, you know, have at it, see how you can do. Since you brought up the term power, we'll go ahead and inject power and politics angle in here also. What did we talk about as being a major source of politics in the workplace? Remember we gave two major drivers of political behavior. Remember what they were? Well, we start off, anybody who can come up with them? I'm sorry? Good, those are sources of power. Okay, so perfect answer to not quite the right question. The question is not where are the sources of power, where are the sources of politics? Where does political behavior come from? I'm sorry? Relationships, okay, yeah. I mean, there are lots of sources of politics, but I gave you guys the two major ones, at least according to the literature.
This is just a guess, but external and internal drivers.
Okay, yeah, I mean, yeah, you can carve it up that way, but it's not what I gave you in class. Anybody remember?
Wasn't it?
What are the two major drivers of political behavior?
Wasn't it like social dynamics and like it was like personal desire was the second one, or it was like a greed or?
Yes, those are all in there, but they're not the ones I gave you. What are the two that I gave you? I'm sorry? Perpetuation of power? Okay, yeah, again, it's all in there, but they're not the ones I gave you. Okay, I'm sorry, what were they again? Yeah, uncertainty was one of them. Scarce resources. Yeah, okay. So yeah, and again, those are all good answers, but the information I gave you during that class was the two major drivers of political behavior in the workforce, according to the literature, are scarce resources and uncertainty. And we talked about how uncertainty can be with regard to almost anything. But one of the major examples we talked about during that class was job descriptions, right? If you want politics in your organization, give unclear job descriptions, right? You're just begging for political behavior. You're not being very clear what people's jobs look like. As we talked about, you know, at least certain individuals will use that as an opportunity to be able to do some power grabs, right? If it's not clear where my job begins and ends and where your job begins and ends, I can try to take some responsibilities from it, right? Basically, it's one political maneuver, right? Political game plan, try to take responsibility for something. And so I'm not necessarily saying that Fester is doing that intentionally, but it is one way of looking at this case, right? It's a possibility that maybe Fester is doing some, you know, maybe intentional power grabbing here, right? To try to grab leadership, as Claudia was pointing out. Again, I'm not saying that that's definitively true. There are different ways to interpret this case, but there's a real possibility here that this lack of clear job assignments, you know, by Gerald, has been triggering some political behavior going on inside the same environment. Very good. Okay, we can stay in the world of leadership. We can go elsewhere. I'm just curious. We can make this kind of a free-ranging conversation. You know, what are some other problems you saw in this case? I'm sorry, Jennifer, was that a hand?
Oh, no, sorry.
It's yeah, so, like I said, it's like an auction, right? You twitch,
Yeah.
I'm all over you. Now, anybody? Other problems here?
I think one of the big problems was Gerald's when he gave feedback.
Okay.
I mean, he did kind of an interview with no one, but the interview seemed to be like, he said, you got to do a really good job with Fester. But if you were to give him any kind of points to adults and said, I have two projects, you're going to lead, you're doing a really good job as the leader, you're the leader.
Yeah.
Rather than talking about this other guy, I mean, there's no reason to focus on that.
Okay. Yeah, and I like that. You know, and so again, you know, a lot of cases like this, you kind of have to read between the lines a little bit. At least there's no information given suggesting that Gerald is doing an effective job of giving multiple feedback, right? And you kind of get the impression, since he's leaving, and has no idea that Gerald is going to be giving Fester a new assignment, you know, to lead some other project. Maybe Gerald was guilty of not engaging in very good feedback.
Yeah. Gerald have a new project here, so you get multiple.
I guess I don't recall that. I think it was he was going to give Fester the chance to either. He was planning to offer Fester, I guess, the Air Force project, right? I could be mistaken. Does anyone recall that? Was Knowlton going to be given a new assignment?
He was going to keep his assignment, but that's was going to be promoted to
Yeah,
the
yeah.
department.
Good, okay. But very good. Maybe some poor feedback or lack of feedback giving on the part of Gerald. What else did you see in the case?
With regards to motivation, the two-factor theory, we have things like Gerald,
Gerald's a big
laws.
boss.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He felt like it was a good idea, and that's kind of the feedback he was, I guess, the feedback he thought he was getting from Milton, that adding Fester to his team was helping because that it was, it was almost like I don't know if it's a working condition or interpersonal relation that factor was on it, but that's going to lead to this dissatisfaction, more of the satisfaction is one thing, or so maybe, well, you consider it that when he, Milton's boss had talked about recognition, that was the type of stuff that you can see at the beginning led to Milton's satisfaction, and we sit around thinking about his recognition.
Yeah, good, I like that. So if I had said, hey, can you apply two-factor theory in this case, I like that, right? Even in the beginning, you get an indication of some satisfaction on the part of Knowlton because he's feeling good about being recognized for the contribution he's making. But as things move forward, I don't know if some of that goes down. You kind of get the sense that at least in Knowlton's mind, that the recognition factor is going down, while other things on the hygiene list are getting worse. So your personal relations, working environment.
Yeah. But the problem statement it might be for Gerald to focus on back on those motivators.
Good. Good. I like that.
That's
Great. No, very good. All right, so in the world of motivation, we've now touched on other thoughts. What else do you guys see as a problem in this case?
I think there's a lot of uncertainty or low probability performance and outcome and expectancy very Gerald has kind of said, well, whoever produces gets ahead of his business, but he's not really sure what it is to produce or perform. And if he does, he really can get the outcome that he wants. So I think that probability is low.
Great, yeah. But yeah, good application of expectancy theory. Connect it up to capital theory. Very good, yeah. Other thoughts? What else do you see here? What else? Communication problems, individual difference issues, even other motivational issues, group dynamics. What do you guys see? What else is what we're not talking about?
Somehow, speaking with all the people who are not just Milton, not just Hester, but all of them have had some kind of issue with Hester. Or Hester, yeah, Hester. But none of us have made known that either Hester or Gerald is not communication. Yeah, he's doing great, but it's kind of oddly.
Good, yeah. So again, from the feedback, communication standpoint, not a whole lot of feedback being given to Fester also as to what's going on, maybe how he's shaping the group up. You can assume that Fester knows this stuff, because I think much of our experience can tell us people often don't have a good sense of it's to some degree a self-awareness issue. They just don't see what the effect they have on other people. They don't understand those kind of issues, and so good time to do some feedback every professor. Don't assume that he gets what's happening. Let's talk to him about it. Try to find out a little bit about why he's doing what he's doing, and then maybe help him through it, help correct it. Because there are all kinds of explanations actually as to why Fester is doing what he's doing. You might assume that it's power grab, right? But not necessarily. And you guys think of other reasons as to why Fester is doing what he's doing?
Yeah, he just shows like a passion for what he's doing, or like his enthusiasm for the artist and that stuff.
Yeah, maybe he's kind of running roughshod over people, but it's just because of passion, or at least largely just driven by passion. Maybe he just needs to become more aware that he needs to, realize, boundaries is a good word, sort of realize that maybe he needs to tone things down a little bit because of the effect it's having on other people. Okay, yeah, can you give that just a second? Yeah, let me give you guys another thought, or a couple of other thoughts, as to maybe why Fester is acting the way he is. One has to do with conflict handling styles. It's actually a topic for next class. The discussion questions that I give you guys for next class, I think I have them for next class. Ask you to fill out your conflict handling styles. I'm not expecting you guys to know this yet. Maybe some of you have looked through that material or have learned it before. What conflict handling style would you argue Fester is showing? You read the chapter, hopefully this is familiar to you. Oh, right. Yeah, I'm actually. Yeah. I think that's actually a good approach to take too, but it's not clear what I'm driving at. In your book, they're given there's a chart, and they talk about what are called interpersonal conflict handling styles. And basically, we'll talk about this next time. It's the degree to which you look out for yourself during a conflict versus the degree that you look out for other people. And there are 5 different styles. There's forcing, usually looking out just for yourself, right? There's avoiding. You don't know what avoiding is. There's accommodating, where you're just kind of looking out for the other person and not for yourself. There's compromising. You all know what compromising looks like. And then there's collaborating. You're looking out for everyone's needs together. So if you follow that, again, I know not everyone read the section. What conflict handling style would you say Fester is using? Yeah, aggressive. Okay, yeah. So you may make some different claims about that, but I think most of us would come down this side and probably forcing. Seemingly kind of looking after his own needs and interests and really not other people. And you could debate that, but I imagine most of us would say forcing. Yeah.
But also, it could be, I mean, whenever you take a job, at least everybody I have met, you work hard for the first couple of weeks to try to get in or to try to press the box, or just to help the other people so they like you.
Yeah.
Maybe you can just think about it.
No, very good. And so I'm just kind of throwing this out there as a possibility. And you could argue that there are different things going on here. That's kind of similar to Kelsey's point about just sort of passion, just kind of hard work and hard, kind of getting at it in his first few days on the job. That's another good explanation. But the point I wanted to make in the world of conflict handling is that at least some might argue that Fester is using a forcing approach. Did you guys read the chapter? You can remember, this case and try that on for size as you read the information about what it means to be a forcer. Just kind of looking out for your own needs and interests and not adequately at least looking out for other people's needs and interests. Whereas what style do you think Knowlton is using? Yeah, I think I heard avoiding. What's that? Oh, yeah. I mean, some might say avoiding, some might say compromising, some might say more accommodating, but a very different style from what Fester is using, right? I would probably argue avoiding, but different people can argue that. But that could be an explanation, again, for sort of part of what's going on here, and maybe Fester's behavior to some degree, is that it has to do with conflict handling style. He's just a force, looking out for his own needs and interests. Another explanation for Fester's behavior gets back to the notion of motivation. You guys got us some good start on how motivation fits into this case. Let's go to the topic of rewarding A while hoping for B. Okay? What gets rewarded in this organization? There are a couple of strong statements in that.
According to the Jared, what's his name? Gerald, yeah. He said that whoever has results gets rewarded.
Yeah, and Knowlton repeats that, right?
Yeah.
It's said a couple of different ways, but basically the person who produces is the person who gets ahead of this organization, right? So that's kind of we can sort of take that, I think, as granted, so that's sort of a reflection of what the organization, is actually rewarding, sort of that individual kind of behavior. What do they want? In the sense of rewarding A while hoping for B. This is a team-based organization, right? They're using teams. And so, again, some might debate this, but what I see in this case pretty clearly is rewarding A while hoping for B. They want good teamwork. But the reward system is set up to reward individualism, right? And so then is it any surprise if you buy that? Is it any surprise that you get, kind of this disconnect, between what Knowlton is, between what Fester is doing compared to what people want him to be doing, right? You could argue he's just chasing the reward system. He's got an accurate read. Maybe he talked to Gerald, and Gerald said, the individual who produces gets ahead around here, and he's just, being an individual, like the reward system suggests he should. But no one likes that, right? Because they're actually sort of a culture of teamwork, and so there's this, again, disconnect. So there's another explanation, right, as to why Fester is doing what he's doing, is that he's just being rewarded for it. People do what's rewarded, right? Even if it may rub up against the culture. That's where some training and feedback would be useful to say, hey, sorry for the confusion, Fester, but that's not how we do things around here, right? We want you to produce, but we also want you to be a good team member, right? A good effective part of the team. Maybe try to change the reward system if you can, to reward people for both, right? Good performance as an individual, but also good team performance. So very good, right? These are all, kind of competing issues as to why Fester is behaving the way that he did. Let me sort of then back off for a second, and then, because there were some other thoughts, I think, Mitch, do you still have a problem statement you wanted to get on the table if I already blown it up? Yeah.
That's not the fact that you remember. It's the perspective of
Great. Okay, very good. Yes, a good team-focused problem statement that we've kind of already touched on. So as you guys can see, we've covered a lot. Maybe we'll do a tiny bit more on individual differences. I'll do that by asking you guys the question, why is Bob Moulton behaving the way he is? Right? Maybe hit on a little bit by saying maybe he has more of an avoiding conflict handling style. Maybe you guys will read more about that in your book. But any other thoughts besides avoiding conflict handling style as to why Bob Moulton is behaving this way?
I kind of got the impression that he was very new at being in a leadership position. And so I think he was, in a way, he was taking a lot of what Fester was doing as a challenge to his leadership rather than looking at it as fantastic. I've got a very bright mind underneath me that I can now use.
Yeah. Okay. Good. I like that line of thinking. That sounds like a good call. Other explanations, other thoughts. Okay. Yeah, we can focus on maybe the lack of confidence, insecurity, some of those kinds of issues. That's actually one of the reasons why I like this case. And one of the reasons why I like to kind of have everybody read it in a class like this is that there are all kinds of reasons, of course, as to why an individual might be insecure or lacking confidence or what have you. But there's an important leadership issue that I want to bring out in relation to that. It's one that I think we've already mentioned previously in class, but I want to make sure that I re-emphasize it here in this case. And that's basically that sometimes managers will, I think, make a mistake in believing that they have to be the smartest person in the room. Remember, I think we talked about this before, right? And maybe that's at least part of what is going on here with Moulton, that he sort of thinks, this is awful, right? I have to go into these meetings and this guy knows more than I do. He's smarter than I am, and et cetera. And so, maybe this wouldn't be you, but you can imagine how a given MBA student could be Bob Moulton, basically, right? Being very threatened in that kind of situation, saying this is not a good situation. I'm the manager, I'm the leader, formal leader, but I'm not the smartest guy at the table, right? And that could be a source of insecurity or lack of confidence or what have you. And again, I want to just have you guys remember this: if you potentially fall into that category for your own future, that you might get feelings of insecurity in that kind of situation. I'd like you to realize that that's not, being the smartest person at the table is not necessary for effective leadership, right? And as I think we said in that previous class, whenever we brought this up, it's actually kind of the opposite, right? That you can make a pretty good case that effective leadership, at least a part of effective leadership, is about, getting as many, Festers around the table as you possibly can, to find the best and the brightest as best you can with whatever resources you have as a manager, and to intentionally hire very bright, capable people. And to realize that that's not, it's not a source of concern for you as a manager. It's actually, a sign of good leadership. You're getting good people around, even if it, even if it means you're not the smartest person, right? So it's just a good thought for you, and it speaks to what your job is as a leader. Is your job to be the smartest, or is it more like just to, get a lot of good people together, put them in the right position, motivate them appropriately, do all the kinds of things that we talk about in a class like this, and get out of their way, get them to the point where you can empower them to do a great job, and hopefully congratulate yourself on good leadership, not poor leadership like But to me, that's one of the key takeaway points from a case like this, is to not let yourself fall into the problem. All right, that's a pretty good run through. I think that's most of what I wanted to get on the table for Bob Moulton. Anything else anybody wants to throw into the mix here?
pretty full of threat, though. I mean, in an ideal world, that is how a manager should work, by getting the right minds in his team. But in reality, a lot of times the right minds are promoted, and I would be afraid of losing my job, and I've got other things to consider on that job security.
Well, maybe especially in a small organization, where there are only going to be so many promotion opportunities, right, available. If it's a big company, there's plenty of room for us all to move up. But yeah, no, it's tough in reality. It's tough in reality, yeah. But again, I would just kind of submit that hopefully, the managers above you are paying attention and realize that, yeah, that other person might be a good candidate for promotion based on, his or her technical merits and intelligence and skills and things like that. But, hopefully you're otherwise just playing yourself as being a good manager. That you're, good at gathering talent, that you're good at empowering people, and those kinds of skills in most situations are going to be more important in terms of moving you up in the level of management than the specific, intelligence or technical ability. But you're right. I mean, I agree with you. I'm not disagreeing with you at all. But hopefully, through just good display of management skills, you'll get the promotion ahead of those other people. But you might not, right? It is a real possibility. So very good. Great. Okay. Well, I think that's real good. I was actually intending to get into our slides for conflict today, but with only a few minutes left, I will just pass back your papers. And just please bring the conflict slides. We'll start on that next class. And yeah, I'm not going to give you guys anything else. You've got plenty to do, right? Just to get your research paper done. So really nothing else new. I'll give you your papers back, and I'll look forward to seeing you on Tuesday.